Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something ambitious. We're cracking open the blueprints for reality itself, as drawn up by the one and only Immanuel Kant. See, he didn't just ask what we know, he asked the much deeper question. How is it even possible for us to know anything at all? This is going to be a journey right into the architecture of your own mind.
And you know, this deep dive comes to us by a special request. It's from the philosophical exploration arm of Energy and Personal Excellence, LLC. So, with that, let's jump right in. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the philosophical crisis Kant was trying to solve. Then, we'll get into his absolutely revolutionary new idea. After that, we'll break down the two key pillars of his whole system. First, how we sense the world, and then how we think about it. And finally, we'll pull it all together and see what it all means.
To really get why Kant is such a big deal, you first have to understand the mess he was walking into. For centuries, philosophy had been totally stuck, caught in this endless tug-of-war between two huge opposing ideas about where knowledge comes from.
And look, Kant himself was not shy about it. He called metaphysics, which is the study of ultimate reality, a battlefield, a place of endless, circular arguments where nobody ever won or made any real, lasting progress. It was just a complete and total stalemate.
So on one side of this battlefield, you had the rationalists. These were the thinkers who said, look, true knowledge comes from pure logic, from reason alone. Our senses, they're messy, they're unreliable. But then, on the other side, you had the empiricists, and they argued the complete opposite. They said, no. All knowledge begins and ends with what we can see, hear, and touch. Each side was completely dug in, and because of it, philosophy was going absolutely nowhere.
And into this philosophical trench warfare steps Immanuel Kant, and he does something brilliant. He doesn't try to settle the debate, he completely changes the game. He doesn't pick a side, he just rewrites the rules for everyone.
He called it his Copernican revolution. For centuries, everyone just assumed that our minds were like passive mirrors, trying their best to get an accurate reflection of the world out there. But Kant just flips that whole idea on its head. He asks, what if it's the other way around? What if objects have to conform to our minds? What if our minds don't just receive reality, but actively construct it using a built-in set of rules?
So this new way of thinking led him to one single critical question. Now, I know it sounds super technical, but just stick with me here, because this is the key to everything. He asked, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Okay, let's break that down. A priori just means knowledge that we have before any experience, things we know just by thinking, like math. And synthetic means a statement that actually adds new information, something that isn't just a simple definition. So what Kant is really asking is, how is it possible for us to use pure reason alone to learn new, universally true things about the world we live in? Let's just make sure we've got this down. On the one hand, you've got analytic judgments. The easiest way to think about these is as definitions. If I say all bachelors are unmarried, I haven't really taught you anything new, right? The idea of being unmarried is already baked into the definition of bachelor. But a synthetic judgment, that's different. That adds new information. Saying all bodies are heavy connects two separate ideas, body and heavy. You're literally synthesizing new knowledge. And Kant's entire project is about figuring out how we can make these kinds of big, expansive claims with the same certainty as 2 + 2 = 4. So how in the world does the mind actually pull this off? Well, Kant starts his investigation not with big, complex thoughts, but with the most basic building block of our experience, just simple sensation. And this first huge part of his project is called the transcendental aesthetic.
And what you're looking at here is Kant's actual blueprint. This is the table of contents from his most famous book, and you can see just how careful and methodical he is. We're going to be focusing on that first part, the transcendental doctrine of elements, which is basically his theory of how we build knowledge. And you can see right away he splits it into two big sections, the aesthetic and the logic.
So, Kant sees this whole process happening in two main stages. First up is the transcendental aesthetic. This part looks at the mind's built-in filters for just receiving raw data from the world. Think of it like the mind's hardware. Then, second, you have the transcendental logic, which examines the mind's built-in software for actually processing that data and turning it into coherent thoughts. Now, don't let that word aesthetic throw you off. This has absolutely nothing to do with art or beauty. For Kant, it comes from an old Greek word that just means sensation. The transcendental aesthetic is basically the science of the mind's factory settings, the fundamental conditions that make it possible for a human being to sense anything at all. And Kant says this factory-installed software has two main components, what he calls two pure forms of intuition. A really good way to think about them is as the fundamental operating system for your senses. He argues that everything we experience from the outside world gets automatically sorted and organized by the grid of space. And every single experience we have, whether it's external or internal, gets arranged, one after another, on the timeline of time.
So listen, here's the really crucial part. Space isn't some giant, empty box that we're all floating around in. No. According to Kant, space is a fundamental structure of our own minds. It is the lens we can never take off. It's the internal grid that our mind projects onto the world so we can make sense of it. It's the very thing that even allows us to understand things as being out there to begin with.
And this slide really gets at Kant's even more mind-bending claim about time. He says that time isn't some river out there in the world that we're all floating down. For Kant, time is the internal film strip of our own consciousness. It's the linear format our mind has to use to arrange every single thought, every feeling, every sensation. I mean, think about it. You literally cannot imagine an experience that isn't in time, because time is the basic structure of your conscious experience.
Okay, so let's recap. Our mind has received a bunch of raw data, and it's filtered it all through these built-in lenses of space and time. But a stream of spatial, temporal data, that's not knowledge yet. It's just noise. The next step is to organize it into something meaningful. And this brings us to the second part of Kant's blueprint, the transcendental logic, which are the mind's rules for building a coherent world.
So Kant breaks this part down into two really important sections. The first is the transcendental analytic. You can think of this as the mind's toolbox. It contains all the pure concepts, what Kant calls the categories, that our mind uses to organize experience. Things like causality, the idea that every event has a cause, or substance, the idea that objects continue to exist over time. See, we don't learn these ideas from experience, we use them to make experience make sense in the first place. And this is how we get real, valid knowledge. But then there's the second part, the transcendental dialectic, and this is basically a giant warning label for that toolbox. It shows us the trouble we get into when we try to use these powerful concepts on things we can never, ever experience. The dialectic is Kant's great takedown of traditional metaphysics. He says that our reason has this natural, almost unstoppable urge to ask the biggest questions about an immortal soul, the origin of the universe, the existence of God. But, and this is the key, because these things are, by their very definition, beyond any possible human experience, our powerful logical tools just start to spin their wheels. They generate paradoxes, contradictions, and illusions. Reason, when it tries to fly beyond the atmosphere of experience, can't help but fall into error.
So, after this incredibly detailed tour of the mind's architecture, what's the grand takeaway? What does all this mean for you and me?
The ultimate conclusion is as profound as it is simple. We do not just passively discover reality, we actively help create it. The world that we know and live in is a joint venture. It's a collaboration between the raw stuff of the universe that comes in through our senses and the non-negotiable, universal structures of the human mind that give all that stuff its shape and form.
And this famous quote, which is inscribed on his tomb, just perfectly captures the two poles of his entire philosophy. On the one hand, you have the awe-inspiring, ordered, predictable universe that we perceive through the structures of our mind. That's the starry heavens above. And on the other hand, you have the equally awesome, structured, and rational world of reason and morality that exists only within us, the moral law within. You know, for Kant, understanding the limits of our own reason isn't a failure. It's the very foundation of true knowledge. And it leaves us with a final, really provocative question. If our minds are the ones shaping the reality we see, then what is the world really like, beyond the limits of our human perspective?